Hey guys, I was listening to the Making Geeks podcast and their discussion of IP theft, especially how it relates to 3D printing, and just kind of wanted to respond to that with some of my background in media arts and just kind of the basic theory with mechanical reproduction and kind of what that means. So I think initially, we're talking about IP theft, intellectual property. I think outside of manufacturing, you see a lot of that now. Just as an example, photographers are finding their images, stuff that they use to advertise the quality, the creativity that they put out. Other people are robbing those images off their websites and putting them up as their own. And while they're not selling those images necessarily, some are. If it's a wedding shot, you're not going to sell the wedding shot directly, usually. But you could say, this is the quality I put out, this is what you're paying for if you hire me, and it's not their work. That is a very easy, free thing for them to steal. It costs them absolutely nothing until they get sued, and usually they get a cease and desist and pull it down. When we add sales into that, it gets even more gross. Like, nobody's going to stand behind anybody stealing somebody else's, right? So stealing somebody's IP is a really, really old concept. There's a really great essay written by Walter Benjamin, and I believe it's from around World War II, that era. But it basically talks about the loss of aura when we recreate something. And then there's a lot of other great points. But to talk about the aura, when we have an original object, I think one of the better examples would be the Mona Lisa. Nobody would object to the original Mona Lisa being art. You can go all the way to the Louvre and wait in line and see it. And the object itself, there's something special about the Mona Lisa. There's something a lot less special when you go to the gift shop and they've got a coffee mug for $10 and it's got a digitally printed copy of that, a facsimile. It does not have the three-dimensional properties of the hand-painted Mona Lisa. It's a forgery, if you will, and we recognize that as normal now. That kind of copy does not carry the same weight as an identical copy, if you will. We've changed the medium, we've changed the size, we've definitely changed the quality. This whole concept of reproduction, Benjamin takes back to woodblock prints and stamp casting, I believe. And he goes back to those to talk about the loss of art, our concept of, is this object still art? So with the casting and the wood blocks, he's saying that we don't have the original anymore. And let's say you were going to have somebody make a gate. If somebody has to hand forge every piece of that gate, it is art. It is handcrafted. Every piece is individually done by somebody purposefully. If you've got one that is machine manufactured in its entirety, human hands are running that operation, but there's no aura to that. There's no originality. The differences that make it special would be way too minute for anyone to really care. And so that's kind of the way that mechanical reproduction doesn't mean much for a very long time in history, or at least in the life of mechanical reproduction. We're talking about the last few hundred years or less. So then we start getting into things, and especially where media theory starts to come out and matter, when we start getting facsimiles, copies of something in the same format. Now, prior to mechanical reproduction, we had things like reproduction furniture. My family owns some reproduction furniture that the reproduction is so old, say from the 50s or 40s or before, that the reproduction itself is an antique, but it's an antique reproduction of a much older antique. So it has a new value that it didn't necessarily have initially. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But we've removed the mechanical part. There's still some art in that. People recreating masterworks by hand, putting in the same type of brush stroke to recreate a painting. There's still art to that, even if it's not the art that the forgery is trying to convince us it is. But when we get into mechanical reproduction and we're creating the same thing, it gets a little more complicated. If you're old enough to remember Napster, it wasn't a new idea in the way that we were stealing music. People had been recording the radio to cassette for decades. The problem is, nobody went after people recording on cassette from the radio because it was a cassette copy. You had to sit there and wait. The effort that went into that was so much more, and the quality so much less, that it wouldn't have been worth going after. And you couldn't really distribute that. You had to have equipment to take a copy and generate enough to really bootleg it properly. So when Napster comes around, we're basically creating a free digital copy. It costs nothing except the storage space. And as technology comes around and everybody has a CD-ROM, everybody has a CDR, everybody has a CDRW, and it just keeps going. And then DVDs are done the same way. It takes, at that point, Metallica and all these other artists and teams of highly paid lawyers to take on the world and actually put in means to stop that. It was directly affecting sales, probably. Definitely more likely to affect sales than, say, the cassette example from earlier, because it was the same. And granted, if you're a real melomane and you're really into your bit rate and all that, fine. You're probably not one of the ones who is going to be looking at a forgery anyway. But so we've got that whole one-to-one recreation, really negligible amount of loss. And so that's important as we move into 3D printing. So now we've got this same digital to digital, everything is exactly the same, but we've got it in a physical form. With 3D printing, if we've got that source file, and it's apparently pretty prevalent, and there are many places like Thingiverse, which was mentioned on the podcast, you can just go out and print the same exact thing. And you can do it ad nauseum as long as you've got the material. And it's the same thing. There's not an aura to worry about, because the thing was created digitally to start with. If we're talking about stealing somebody's model, that model is the same on their computer as it is on mine, from their printer as it is on mine, as long as the settings are similar. So it's really the closest thing to a true forgery, if you will. And that's really scary, brave new world for us. The only other thing I can think of that's on that level in manufacturing is when people outsource manufacturing to China and these other places that don't really take copyright seriously on a federal level. They reuse the molds and then sell a cheaper run of the product. You can hear about this kind of thing. The Smart Passive Income podcast has talked about it a little bit. I think Jimmy DiResta has talked a little bit about the issues with sending back and forth molds with places overseas. But there is a cost of entry that is pretty high in that regard. A $200 3D printer gets you in the door, and then you're popping out forgeries that are 100%, to the T identical. So it's really kind of insane. And how do you go about policing that? I was on the original unpaid for Napster, and as a kid got pretty upset when we started legislating against that kind of thing. I didn't see it as any different than when I was ripping cassettes. But we had DRM come out, and DRM was terrible, telling you when and where you could play the music that you had paid for, or gotten, however, that's terrible. And I think that the open source community that really drives 3D printing would probably have a huge problem with DRM kind of things coming as consumers. Now, as people putting out content, DRM sounds like the greatest thing ever. I get to manage my stuff when it goes out into the world, but if the consumer hates it, then you lose the entire point of putting it out, right? So it's really an interesting thing to forecast what will happen, to think about how we would even deal with it. I think going back to Mark's comment, I think really don't be a D-bag about it is about the best we can do without fighting. And I think if your community mindset can gather around that and self-police, that would be much healthier, but probably not as effective in the long run. I think the other thing that's scary about 3D printing and theft is that the 3D printer, while it does take a couple hours, it's basically the manufacturing equivalent of a Xerox. You can crank these out. You can print multiples at the same time if the part and print bed ratio is right. You can crank these out by comparison. If you look at other manufacturing techniques, Ray Pena did a really great video recently comparing his very expensive to create 9-gear fidget spinner, and also his 3-gear, to the Chinese knockoffs. And they did a decent job forging it from a picture, but he goes through all the different things that make his better, first of all, and second of all, more expensive, more intricate, and you can kind of see just this level of detail that's lost. You can go through the entire Benjamin essay and compare the two and see the loss of the art. And with 3D printing, if you've got that source, you pretty much just hit print. Not to take away from the knowledge you have to operate a 3D printer, but by comparison to Ray's fidget spinner, there are multiple machines required to create that. There is a range of materials required, and when we compare that, especially to the basic examples with a small 3D model, there's a huge difference. So 3D printing is really, it's the Wild West. It is unregulated, maybe as it should be, but it's out there, it's wide open, and it's not cool if you're trying to put stuff out for the community. But I think open source software laws would be really great to apply. I know that the concept of Creative Commons is out there. I think that's one of the most widely misunderstood things out there, probably worse than copyright and fair use. Going out and pulling something offline because it was in a Google image search, most of us probably know better than that. But really now you need a clear, here's the license I'm providing this under. A lot of people go search and find free music, and because they were able to download it for free, they think that they can just pop it in. And it would be the same thing with the 3D model. I think we need express, clear licensing. Commercial reproduction with editability. And I think everything should have attribution. I think to reiterate the point, it's the absolute least you can do without outright stealing. And I mean, yeah, okay, a 3D model of something that's, not much more than a couple cylinders and, polygons, whatever. Maybe it's not that intricate, but if you're using it, it's obviously worthwhile in some way. So I don't think there's any level where the product is less worthy of being attributed to the original person. And I think a lot of that might come back to the public understanding of what it is. And I'm a little rusty on the entirety of the Benjamin essay that I mentioned earlier. But I think the mass culture misunderstands the mechanical reproduction. It's just a thing that came off the printer. You just hit a button and you had it. And we all know that there's a lot more to that, especially when we're talking about, designing it from nothing. I'm terrible at 3D modeling currently, and trying that has really opened my eyes to what all goes into it. And I think that folks who buy a 3D printer and want to make it work, but maybe don't have that modeling experience, or folks that want to go purchase it off eBay, they're not necessarily going, okay, let me see your license before I buy this. But maybe they should. Maybe publicly we can kind of make that a more understood norm. But I think the community is going to have to push that. I don't think anybody else will. And I think if we gave it over to any sort of legal recourse, I think it gets nasty before it gets better. Maybe that makes it quicker, but that's not really the route I prefer. All right, guys, if you made it this far, I would love to hear some feedback. Do you guys like discussing media theory? Did you have problems with points I brought up? Did you think that it was absolutely awesome and I should do more of it? Let me know down in the comments. I will be linking to everybody I talked about, the Making Geeks podcast, Ray Pena. All of that will be in the description below and probably in the cards around me. So be sure to give me a holler. Let me know what you think.